Well, hello and welcome back to the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint live series. My name is Guy Stevens. I am the host and also the executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. Excited to have you here today. We've got a great show on tap for you today. And we are excited to continue doing this work that we're doing to try to bring about some change here. Those of you that are not familiar with the Alliance, the organization was started about 4 years ago, really with a focus on how do we reduce and eliminate restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment. We do a lot of work really aimed at how to reduce and ultimately eliminate the school to prison pipeline, and to try to change policies, laws, minds, hearts, and all that we can, so that we can do better for our kids, our teachers, our staff, and so many others. And of course, the mission always grows. We don't want to see these things happening to people anywhere that they might be, in terms of things like restraint, seclusion. So we've got a big mission, a big vision, and are always excited to have you joining us for another live event. So today, I'm really excited to have a fellow Maryland resident with me. I don't have as many Maryland residents with me, and this is really exciting because I'll tell you in a minute, but I actually met our next guest from a common connection in Kansas, which just shows you how the world works these days, right? You meet somebody right down the street, and in fact, you meet them through somebody in another state. But I'm really excited here today to have Leonard Webb joining us for a really special interview. Leonard is a consultant, somebody who's working to end the school to prison pipeline and who's doing some amazing work. And I'll tell you more about Leonard in just a moment. I do want to let you know that, as always, all of these live events are recorded, and you will be able to watch live on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn. And after the fact, you can go back to Facebook, LinkedIn. I can't talk here. Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and watch them there. We also make all of our programs available as an audio podcast. So if you prefer to listen on the go, you want to listen in your car, you can find it on Spotify, you can find it on Google, you can find it on iTunes, anywhere that you might listen to or download podcasts. You can find our AASR live podcast. So this will be available to you in lots of different ways after the fact. So with all that, let's get to the really fun stuff. And before I introduce our guest, if you happen to be watching live now, you know the drill. I love to see who you are, and I love to see where you're from. So if you would be so kind in the chat, let us know who you are, let us know where you're from, and we'll share that information here with Leonard as well. Because it's always a lot of fun to see who's joining us. So with that, I'm going to bring Leonard up on the screen and kind of read through your introduction here. Leonard, I'm really excited to have you here today. And let me tell folks a little bit about who you are, what your background is, and what you're doing before we get into our conversation. And of course, you are retired from law enforcement, and you retired to focus on improving the educational outcomes for students and improving relationships between administration, teachers, parents, and students. And of course, like you, we think relationships are really critical here. You've been focused on directly addressing the school to prison pipeline by providing equity-based solutions, bringing accountability to school leaders while increasing attendance, decreasing suspensions and expulsions. And it's always amazing to see that kind of work because, we find that it's their causal relationship. The more kids are being suspended, expelled, subjected to, all sorts of punitive discipline, the more likely, of course, they might be to enter that school to prison pipeline. And your work with schools and in the community led you to being appointed by our governor here at the time in Maryland, Governor Hogan, to the Juvenile Justice Board for the state of Maryland, which is fantastic. And of course, you also offer this really unique perspective on the school to prison pipeline, as well as solutions. And that's really important because in this kind of work that we do, often we might find ourselves talking about the things we don't want to happen, the things we don't want people to do, but solutions are so critical. You spent 19 years as an adjunct professor at Potomac State College of West Virginia University, and 27 years with the Federal Bureau of Prisons counseling men. You've seen both sides of the pipeline, and you have seen young people enter your office in prison and people with similar demographics enter your college classroom. Leonard supports criminal justice and education reform, but he's also learned that investing in young people's off hours, building relationships, and supporting social emotional learning and are pragmatic and consequential ways to help end the school to prison pipeline. And Leonard, first of all, we are super excited to have you here today. Very aligned with your work, your mission to put an end to the school to prison pipeline. So let me just start off by saying welcome. Happy to have you here today, and happy to get in this discussion with you today.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. It's great to have a fellow Marylander do this.
Absolutely. Soon, well, actually, probably as soon as now, the crabs are becoming coming back to season. The blue crabs, and some of what Maryland is known for as coming as we get into the summertime, and of course the Chesapeake Bay, which is iconic in the state, and of course you're over in the mountain areas, and
Yes.
a lot of people don't really realize that while Maryland is a fairly small state, sometimes people call it Little America because you can go from kind of the coastal region to the mountains all as you drive across Maryland. So it's a beautiful area. I think I was sharing with you that my son is looking to go to college up in the part of Maryland where you are now. And that's really beautiful space. I will let you know that we've got people, as I mentioned to you, joining us from, all over, as we often see. We've got somebody here from Indiana. Allie says, I'm in Granger, Indiana. I'm a school counselor in a high school. I'm going to start my dissertation on trauma responsive practices in school. Fantastic. We have Beth here from San Jose, a parent of 2 autistic sons, teacher of kids with autism, ADHD, dyslexia, advocator with Lives in the Balance, which is another fantastic organization, also focused on the school to prison pipeline. We have, my son is currently in Pendleton Juvenile Correctional Center. He has an intellectual disability and a laundry list of other diagnoses. I'm working with people at the state level to pass bills in regards to parent and children rights in the juvenile justice system. I'm sure we'll find that, Leonard, you have some thoughts and experiences there that'll probably be really relevant. And I've got Tracy here joining us from Idaho. My son is 12 and is in the school to prison pipeline. So we have a pretty broad audience that we have here at the Alliance. And just to give you an idea, we have a lot of parents whose children are often on the wrong side of a lot of disciplinary practices, restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment. We also have a tremendous number of self-advocates. We have a large population of autistic self-advocates. We also have a lot of educators, teachers, administrators, paraprofessionals, as well as, kind of related service providers, occupational therapists, speech language pathologists, psychologists, really a broad community. And why I think that's important, and I think you'll probably agree with me, is that it's about how do we come together towards change. You mentioned in your bio kind of this idea of solutions, and you mentioned your background in law enforcement, and you certainly have seen a lot of sides of what we're going to be talking about today, which is really talking about that school to prison pipeline and what we can do to move in a better direction. So you've got a lot of perspective here, but let me start off by let's go back to the beginning for a second. What brought you to law enforcement, and then how did that lead to a transition into education? So if I can just ask you to tell us a little bit of your story of, what led you initially down the road that you took. And at some point, it seems like you kind of took a pivot, and probably very much supporting the same people, but in maybe a more upstream capacity, rather than working people that might have been kind of later down that road. So tell us a little bit about you and your story, and how you ended up where you are.
I grew up in New York, and I saw a lot of crime and drugs, and a lot of people that I cared about fall victim to that. And my first thought was, I want to go to college and I want to do something that can change lives. And in New York, there was a lot of police brutality and things like that going on. And I said, well, if I get into law enforcement, I can change that. I can be the person that sparks that change. And my first job out of college was a police officer. And I lasted less than 6 months.
Hmm.
I quickly realized that I wasn't going to change anything from that point, which was sad for me because I thought I could, but there was a culture in law enforcement that I learned early on that just doesn't support what I wanted to do in the way I wanted to do it. I got in the prison system, and I was fortunate to get into counseling, and I felt like I was making a difference. I felt like, at least for the men that I was around, that I made a difference in their lives. And just the conversations that we had, when you're in prison, there's a staff and people that are incarcerated dichotomy that exists where you can't tell them anything and they don't tell you anything. And my whole experience went contradictory to that. I walked through visiting rooms where guys would say, here's my wife, here's my mother, here's my family. I want to introduce you to Mr. Webb. And I had families calling me and saying, thank you, and just wanting to talk. And I knew at that point that relationships mattered. I didn't know how much, but I knew relationships had a lot to do with changing people. And as I went on in the prison system, I got diversified into programs. I started a program for young offenders, and it led to a program for drug offenders that were about to release. And through government work, I was getting awards, I was getting raises, I was getting real comfortable. And until I started an adjunct position at a local college. And when I started there, I noticed that some of these students look just like the guys that come to my office in prison.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought about, why is this happening? And then I started to dig deeper. I started asking questions and, why, what happened? And a lot of it went back to schools getting removed, getting expelled, dropping out, things like that. But what I also came to find out was the guys that would come into my office in the prison, I had to make sure that I offered them, if they had a educational difficulty, that I offered them every 6 months an evidence-based program to deal with their educational difficulty, whether they had 2 years or a life sentence. Every 6 months I had to do that. So when I started working at the college and there were some kids that were having difficulties, they told me about these interventions that they got while they were in schooling.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went back to the guys that were incarcerated and I said, did the school provide anything for you? And they were like, no, we got, a whole bunch of no's.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, why does a person have to come to prison to get offered evidence-based programming for their difficulties? Why isn't it offered, when they find out when they're in kindergarten or first grade or second grade, or whenever that happens? So I kind of had a little pushback on how things were being done. And there was a quote by Desmond Tutu, and it says, sometimes you have to stop pulling people out of the river and find out why they're falling in.
Well, one of my favorites in the world. It makes so much sense. Yeah.
And it just describes my journey. And I in law enforcement, you can retire if you're 50 after 20 years, if you're under 50 after 25, or in federal law enforcement, there's an automatic out at 57. And here I was at 47 years old, spent 26 years in the system, building up, the 401ks and health insurance and all that kind of stuff. And I said, and I guess God called me, and I feel like God called me before, I just wasn't listening. Or I changed my name and he was calling me.
Wrong number.
Yeah, I don't know what happened, but at that point, I walked into the warden's office and I said, it's time for me to do something different. Because I didn't feel the support from the prison system to do
Right.
what I really thought would be helpful.
Well, as I recall from chatting with you before, um, you came, you, I think, had this way about working with people that was very based on relationships and getting to know people. And as you said, some of the things you were doing were kind of like probably pushing up against the system. I'm sure you had some people telling you, well, you can't do that, you shouldn't do this. Yet you recognized intuitively that connection was really important. Did you get a lot of pushback as you were trying to bring in things to benefit people? Tell us a little bit about that.
It started with just simple things like a handshake. And my thing was, if they're going to release from prison, a handshake is something that they need to understand is important when you're going to look for a job.
Mm-hmm.
And so I initiated handshakes when they saw me, no matter where it was. And that got a lot of pushback from staff. Why are you shaking hands with inmates? And the first thing for me is, they're not inmates. That's the name you call them. That's the name you gave them.
Mm-hmm.
But they're human beings. And I'm going to treat them like human beings because they're going to be in the streets one day and I want them to be successful. So we do handshakes and I'd rate their handshake, not firm enough, your hands are sweaty. And they enjoyed that. But not just for the fact that it was something that they can use when they get out. They felt that they belonged. Like somebody can see them, somebody can hear them. And
Absolutely. I was thinking those words as you said it. It's, what we all want. We want that connection. We want to be seen. We want to be heard. We want to be valued. We don't want to be inmate number X, Yeah. When did you, again, you mentioned the quote there, which is one that I love, but when did you make the connection kind of upstream in terms of that school to prison pipeline?
I think it was, there are guys in particular that were just brilliant that I met, doing the prison work. And they were and they all had their own gifts. And one day it was like, why are you wasting your gifts here? And I realized that there may have been choices for them to get there, but there's a part that was played in their lives. There was trauma that was in their lives that was unresolved. And I wanted them to share their gifts with the world. Mm-hmm. And the best way to do that is, as a child, kids in school, to recognize the gifts that they have. And that kind of was, okay, I have to stop pulling out, which depressed me at first because I felt like it was really the only thing I was ever really good at, where I was just above everybody else, where I was unique. I had a special way of doing things.
But you were also swimming upstream with probably sometimes people that didn't see the same value in terms of the what you were doing and the impact of it, but said, hey, this pushes against the system. That's not good. And that's a tough place to be. I mean, it's a tough place to be when you're in a culture or a system that needs to change, needs to improve, and you're trying and you're making a difference. You're making a difference for the individuals that you're working with. But I'm sure that was incredibly
systems needed improved.
Mm-hmm,
it was, in the prison system itself. And like I said, it started with simple stuff, handshake, and then I was fist bumping. Mm-hmm. And that was just a common thing to do.
Right.
And that got a lot of pushback, and I got funding for a library. So I did get some support. Mm-hmm. And you think about what's happening now. Nobody told me what books I could bring in. It was just books I thought they'd be interested in, so there was no ban of my books
Right,
that
right,
came
right,
in.
right. Well,
Um,
what's the old saying about sometimes better to beg forgiveness than ask permission? Uh,
so,
that might have been the better approach there for sure. Well, tell us about some of the programs that you and some of the things that you did, in the prison system, and then we'll get into kind of talking
mhm,
about what happened after that. But what were some of the things that you did, other than kind of treating people differently? It seems to me that you brought some programs in to help individuals and to make a difference, hopefully, when and if they were able to get out. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you were doing there?
mhm. The first program was for 18 to 30-year-olds because that demographic got into the most trouble in prison.
Mm,
And what would happen is they received their sentence, whether it be, and they had to have over 5 years sentence. And what would happen, they get to their end of the sentence and they're thinking they're going to get out by their daughter's graduation. But since their transition into the prison was difficult, they didn't realize they lost good time and things like that. And what I first wanted to do was highlight your treatment starts the minute you come into prison. Your release plan starts the minute you come into prison. A lot of times when men are incarcerated, it's I'm going to do time, but actually they're letting time do them.
mm,
And so it was making goals and keeping that out date in the front of their mind and not just something when they come and say, oh, you're getting released on this date. Well, I thought I was getting released on this date. Now you have to tell your family you're not going to be home for Christmas. And it was just some of that prevention. And I always said when I was in the prison system, if you can predict it, you can prevent it. So there were things that I saw in the data that I could predict that I automatically wanted to prevent. And the first part was the youngest get in the most trouble.
mm,
So let's focus on the youngest and keep them out of trouble, which benefits the prison system because you don't
mm,
have as
mhm,
much
mhm,
incidents and things like that. And the next step was to have a plan. This is, I don't have a GED or I don't have this. To set up a plan to use their time wisely. Because a lot of times they get caught up in prison politics, uh, focusing too much on their bodies, and not in the law library or in the library just reading or keeping up with current trends. They keep up with current music, but not with current trends that are going on in the world. Um, and the most important one is dealing with the trauma that may have
mhm, mhm,
happened in their family, which it expanded into school systems and learning how to deal with that. A lot of what's now called social emotional learning
mhm,
was what I was doing, is figuring out that process to better deal with the emotions.
mhm, mhm. I think there are probably a number of people that are going to watch this either now or later, and I can tell you there's a lot of concern among members of our community about their own children and the potential of their own children kind of going down the school to prison pipeline. And of course, one of the things that we see, I was looking at some data the other day that indicated that people in federal and state prisons that the rate of disability was astronomically high. It was something like 60%. Um, how does that kind of go with your experience? I mean, did you find that a lot of people that you were working with may have had disabilities? And we're talking about such a broad range. I mean, we're talking about ADHD, we're talking about autism, we're talking about dyslexia, dysgraphia, and of course, we know that kids that are not having their needs understood and recognized in school
Mhm.
are at a far greater risk. So talk to me a little bit about that. If you, kind of can tell a little bit about your experience in working with the folks that you were working with.
One of the things that kind of got me in trouble was even if they had a high school diploma,
Hmm.
I referred them anyway to get testing because you could have a high school diploma and still have those type of difficulties. Um, so
Well, that sounds like good trouble to be causing.
yeah, it was good trouble. It was
Sorry.
good trouble.
Yeah.
That's a good way to put it. But
Yeah.
I referred everybody. just so, it's something that's unseen. I didn't want to be part of pushing people through, give them a C so they're done.
Mm.
And that got pushed back from some of the guys too. Hey, I got a high school diploma. Why are you doing this? I was like, I'm just being cautious.
Right, right.
I can prevent it. I can predict it. But I think,
I
after,
love that. If you can predict it, you can prevent it. I
yeah,
love that idea. Yeah.
yeah. And I think, like, looking at the chat, and I see, people that are saying their loved one is in the school to prison pipeline or in juvenile services. And I believe there's a narrative how we got here. And the narrative of preschoolers getting kicked out of school, 5-year-olds getting handcuffs put on them, padded rooms, and corporal punishment and all that stuff. It's the same narrative back in the 90s for mass incarceration.
Mm-hmm.
They just changed the names of what's been happening. 3 strikes is 0 tolerance.
Mm-hmm.
And, tough on crime is just more police in schools.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we've treated drug dependency the same way. We treated it as a crime issue rather than a health issue.
Right, right,
and
right.
We're doing the same thing. We're going along the same narratives with our school system. We're treating child behavior as crimes.
Mm-hmm.
And what's driving this is fear and anger. And we can't support our children if the driving forces are fear and anger. It's just not possible. And all our stakeholders have to work together, the parents, the administrators, the teachers. And that's what I was trying to do in the prison system, which the educational system has the same obstacles. I mean, there are just, unfortunately, people in the profession that have a low opinion of the people that are most affected by the school to prison pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
Children with disabilities and Black and brown children, minorities, and children of poverty.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many in the profession that just have a negative opinion and don't value people that are affected by it.
Yeah. And I mean, I always say, I mean, it's, as you said, it's kids with disabilities, Black and brown children, kids with a trauma history. I mean, if we want to, go back to even data of looking at data related to adverse childhood experiences and the correlation between childhood trauma and kids that are having difficulty and not getting the help they need. And I mean, there's some really troubling things that happen. Even when you begin to look at, I mean, you can go upstream even further and say the racial discrepancy in diagnoses. That 2 kids that present in a very similar way, a Black child might get an emotional disturbance label and a white child might be diagnosed with autism. And, we see these things that are shaping the perceptions really happening very far upstream. But, again, these are children that need our help, not our consequences. And, many of the kids, I think that we see that are being restrained, secluded, suspended, expelled, subjected to corporal punishment, that are getting pushed down that school to prison pipeline. These are our most vulnerable kids that most need our help and support. And it's really upsetting to see the response, which is let's do more of what's not working. And we know it's not working. Let's do more. And these last couple of years, of course, have been really challenging, right? We had the pandemic, we had global trauma that affected people. I think that many of us could look in the future prior to kids going back to school after COVID and say, well, it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough when kids are back in school. They've missed out on critical time. They've missed out on critical opportunities, things like social emotional learning as well. They've missed out on connection. They may be carrying trauma in. They may have lost loved ones. We could have predicted that we would see an increase in some challenges, and we might see an increase in some of the behaviors that are really related to stress and trauma. And we have, and yet, if you look around the country, there are places that are moving in the right direction, but there's a lot of places that are moving back in the wrong direction. We had a district at the beginning of last year that said, we want to bring back corporal punishment. It's like, really? The things that we know just don't work. So let's move forward a little bit. You're
Mhm.
you're you're in the you work your career in law enforcement in the the prison system. You begin to think, hey, I'm getting tapped on the shoulder here. I got something else here that I'm going to do. It's not over for me yet. You begin doing some teaching at the college. Let's talk about after the tap on the shoulder, what happened and what you started doing next.
My next thing, I wanted to see how schools function. So I
Okay.
started substitute teaching,
Okay.
um, to be an inside, kind of get an inside view of what was happening rather than just going off of my assumptions. And there were a couple things that I found uh, that were disturbing to me. And there were some things that, made me feel good.
Mhm.
But being a educator of color, I really didn't feel like I was respected.
Mm.
And everything that I was pushed to do had to do with discipline. And I think a lot of that had to do with I was a man and also that I was a man of color. And amazingly, the first long term sub opportunity that I was offered was in an alternative school,
Mm.
which functioned just like a prison.
Mm.
And when I went there, it was like I never left prison. You
Mm.
had the same uh, controlled movements. You had the same police walking around telling you, take your hat off, pull your pants up.
Mm.
It was the same atmosphere that I had just left. And I started the relationship building, which again wrangled people the wrong way.
Mm.
And I said, there's no difference between this and the prison system. It just isn't, which
Right.
was really
Right.
sad.
Right.
And having these kids placed in here to only experience a type of prison, which is even worse when they go into juvenile facilities. And I just said, the justice system can't solve your problem.
Mm. Mhm.
I spent 27 years in the justice system. The justice system can't solve your problem in the classroom. Stop sending these children into the justice system. And this alternative school was just a form of the justice system.
Mm. Mhm. Mhm.
The juvenile justice system is just like the minor leagues. And when you
Mm.
start arresting and handcuffing children, that's not the solution.
Right. Yeah,
And
and I mean, certainly prisons should probably be less like prisons, but the thought that
absolutely.
you're creating schools that operate in the same way, and then wondering, why kids are I mean, I think about the school to prison pipeline, and it begins with things that are being done to kids, very often in the name of discipline, very often kids that are being misunderstood, very often kids that have trauma, kids that have disabilities, kids that have already had a tough go. And we hear things that just blow my mind. Um, and it's interesting because, again, I mean, I look at this, I look at a kid that's being restrained, secluded, suspended, expelled, subjected to corporal punishment. And what I see is a kid who we're not meeting that kid's needs. Maybe we don't know what it is yet, but we're not understanding that child's needs and how to support them appropriately. And like you said, many of these kids are very young. I was reading something the other day about a kindergarten student. And basically, as you read the story was this violent kindergarten student. Of course, I have objection to the word violent being used
Yeah.
there, but that assumes intent and what I think you're seeing as a child that's having a difficult time. But what happens is, this child's having a hard time. The school's not meeting their needs. And then suddenly other parents are outraged and concerned, which I understand. But at the same time, it's like, let's get the mob with the torches and get that child out of our classroom.
Yeah.
Where do you want that child to go? I mean, this idea of wanting to exclude kids. Well, I don't want this kid in my classroom anymore. I get it. I get there are kids that are perhaps a challenge and that need more help and support, but we can't just as a society discard people. Like, they're just not worth the effort. And I think ultimately that's part of what happens. I mean, and when kids as young as 5 years old are being viewed in that way, don't you think it's so harmful?
And a lot of times I ask educators, what about your trauma?
Right.
And how is this affecting your relationships with these students? Because I think a lot of educators don't understand their own trauma
Mm-hmm.
and how kids may trigger that. So one of the things that I tell a lot of educators is try and understand your trauma, because what I see sometimes is there's a meme that goes around, and it has a person on there that's like this, and it says your reaction when you find out that child in your classroom has a younger sibling.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I go back, if you can predict it, you can prevent it. So
Mm-hmm.
if they have a younger sibling, rather than be disappointed or have a negative reaction to that younger sibling, understand that you've already got some data from the older sibling. You already know some of the things that that child is going through, whether it's food insecurity, a parent that's incarcerated, or have drug use. If the previous sibling has been coming late. Well, if they're in elementary school and they're coming late, that's not their fault. They don't drive. So there's certain things that we're not adjusting to. And part of, and I'm not making a blanket of all educators, but we're just learning the effects of trauma really right now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's something that's new to us. This wasn't a discussion when I was in school. And I don't remember it being a discussion when my kids were in school. And I have a 2021 graduate. I just started hearing about it by the time he was in high school. And there are 35 million children that in the country that are affected by trauma. And that's probably a low number.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But we're quick to go back to normal. Like
Right.
in Maryland, you probably know, we're back to standardized testing,
Mm-hmm.
test
Mm-hmm.
schedules. What happened?
Yeah.
COVID could have been a time of renaissance for
Right.
education, and we
Yeah.
dropped the ball already.
Right. Right. Right.
We're still in kind of the pandemic, and we've already dropped the ball.
Yeah. No, I would agree with you. I would agree with you. I think, although what happened was I think really difficult, there was somewhat of an opportunity there to think about things in a different way. And I think the emphasis on academic catch up over, hey, let's support humans for a while, and let's really focus on connection and helping people feel safe again. You mentioned the trauma piece, and of course, we've got the knowledge of trauma now. We've got the knowledge of the neuroscience that can really help us understand like why human behavior is what it is, and to look at things differently. And then that's part of the solution to me is how do we get this in more schools? But let me pause for a second. I just want to hit a couple of comments here. And if you are watching and you have a comment or a question or something you want to share, please feel free to put that in the chat. But before I get to those, Leonard, I just want to ask you, tell me about the names on the board behind you. Whose names are on the board there behind you, and who are they?
They are students in the Next Generation Scholar Program here in Allegheny County, and just they got a little shout out here. I
Well,
left it on the board.
absolutely, and I can't read them all, but I can see some of them there. Why
It's
don't you read a couple of names? I see Katie.
Katie, Kaylin, Allison, Maya, Victoria, and Kyla.
All right, fantastic. Yeah, and a
Thank
shout out
you.
to your students. I couldn't let that go. We had to give them a shout out. Now you have to tell them they have to watch it. So you got to
I'll
shout out.
probably just clip it.
That's right. That's right. There you go. Let me just get to a couple of the comments here. Jamie, a friend and colleague in the UK, just kind of shared experience here. I have lived experience as a sibling of a person with intellectual disabilities and autism, who, without trail or hearing, was sentenced to 15 years in secure facilities. I broke him out to a place of safety. As well, he was being abused. I am now also a well-being consultant, leading organizations and staff teams via co-production to reduce, eliminate restrictive practices. Jamie, I appreciate you sharing your story. Yeah, I mean, it can be really tough, and of course, I think the frequency of disability and individuals that are moving down that school to prison pipeline is something absolutely real. All right, let's see what else we have here. Tricia said, narrative preschoolers getting kicked out, 5-year-olds suspended, padded rooms. Yes, the same narrative driven by fear and anger. Amen. Chantel, who's actually our lead volunteer in Canada, said that her best friend's autistic 10-year-old son was put into prone restraints and handcuffs by police and his principal just a few weeks ago in New Brunswick, Canada, because he was in a fight or flight mode after being traumatized by various adults putting him in restraints since he was 3 years old. This needs to stop. Let's see.
And that's that really hits home after being in law enforcement for so long and training law enforcement officers. Law enforcement personnel aren't trained to do the work for children. They're trained to do law enforcement. They're not trained educators. So from a law enforcement perspective, being disruptive in class is a crime.
Mm-hmm.
And the interaction is like you've committed a crime. There's a questioning involved. It's what's wrong with you rather than what's happened to you. And that's how law enforcement treats things. And that's one of the biggest problems of bringing police into schools, because they're usually not trained, typically, and they bring the law enforcement culture into the school, which does not support child brain development, which does not support social and emotional learning. And until we start getting those people that are trained in those things into the schools rather than spending the money on law enforcement, our country will never, ever have an unwavering commitment to our students.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Our country has never had an unwavering commitment to our students' success.
Do you think, one of the things that, we see is that there are approaches in law enforcement that are very similar to approaches we see in education, and whether which is influenced by which we can leave open for discussion. But there's often a very compliance-based approach in law enforcement. There's often a very compliance-based approach with education.
Yes.
And Leonard, I can tell you the many individuals and families, whether they're parents or even the educators with their own kids or whoever it may be, when I begin to ask them about their children and what their goals are for their kids, never yet have I had a parent say, my goal is to raise a compliant child. Yes, we want children that can fit in society and in structured, settings and all of that. I saw you right there. But at the same time, compliance shouldn't really be the goal. But do you think that, that's part of the problem is just that we're so focused on compliance?
Absolutely. It's still sit and get from the 1920s.
Right.
And this is not the world our children are living in. I have a grandson that I don't know what kind of world he's going to walk into. But sit and get is over. We remember when, we're close in age. Remember when a teacher would say, you're not going to always have a calculator on you.
Right.
Well,
right.
You know what? These kids do.
That's right. That's right.
The world is different.
Yeah. Well, and I remember the many times that my fellow Gen Xers asked questions like, when am I going to need this in real life? And I can tell you, there are a lot of things I haven't needed in real life. All right. I want to get to a couple more comments here. Ali said relationships are so important. Agreed. Angie, who's another Marylander, Frederick, as I recall, what kind of reform can be done about this? Let's look at this for what it is really about, money and discrimination. I'm writing letters daily to political figures. So I want to get into that in a minute with you in more detail. But what's your short answer about what people that are watching this today can do to help bring about change?
The hey, sorry about that.
We knew that we'd get a visitor.
Yeah,
Oh, good.
he was kind of shy. He didn't want to come in.
It's all right.
I think, and I saw somebody say, I think I lost a comment around the same thing, but we can't put it off on the parents, because a lot of our parents are adult children of trauma, and they don't have the tools or the framework without the support that educators or policymakers, if they don't have that, they can't support them. It's like, I don't know, asking a baby to stop crying, because they just don't have the tools to do it. So one of the most important things is providing parents the tools and the support they need to, there it is, the blaming parents part. And we can't blame the parents. They, a lot don't have the support or the tools they need to help, and they need that support. And if they get the support, maybe they have the tools, and compassion is gone. For parents in the situation, I think the first thing you have to do is review your school's disciplinary policy. And what you're looking for, are there zero tolerance policies in there? Because zero tolerance is a big push in the school to prison pipeline. Those, if you do this, you're out, and that can be interpreted in many ways. So zero tolerance policies just don't work anyway. So you're looking for that. You're looking for anything that's been amended or anything that's been added new. And when you see those things, your next step is to ask questions. And people say it all the time, there's no such thing as a dumb question. And I know a lot of parents, when they get into a room of educators and educators start spitting out 504s and IEPs, it can be intimidating, but you can't be afraid to ask questions. You have to be that parent sometimes. If they don't know your face, make sure they know your email.
Yeah. And questions can be really powerful. I had a kind of a friend and mentor that used to say that when you ask questions, you control the narrative. And, I'm a big fan of, even very simple approaches like continuing to drill down by asking why. The first answer you get, if it doesn't really make sense, ask that question why. And sometimes by asking why repeatedly, we get down to really what's going on. And sometimes people even begin to doubt their own assertions after you've really just kind of asked questions. So why can be a really powerful question. So, looking at the policies, maybe going to a school board meeting and bringing up concerns that they have, connecting with other parents or families. Those are all things that people might do.
Yep. Get involved. That was my next thing. You get involved. And it goes the same way with educators. Your first call to a parent shouldn't be your child's in trouble.
Right.
Your first call should always be, I'm happy to have your child in my class. Is there anything I need to know?
Right.
That everybody should have that first call. And then you want to look critically at some trends. Who's getting suspended? Who's getting expelled? Who's getting, ISS and things like that. And
because if you can predict it,
you can prevent it.
That's right. I love that. Yeah. And you've often have data. You can ask, people and say, who are the frequent flyers in your school discipline program? These are kids that need help. They don't need more zero tolerance, more, policies that are going to exclude them. And because a kid that gets excluded enough, a kid that gets enough punishment becomes disengaged. What kind of person wants to go to a place that you don't feel welcome?
Yeah. And then look for the root causes. A child that's coming late, you may find out that child has to take a younger sibling to school before they come to school. Can't get on a bus. If, again, back to the why. And again, getting back to relationships, there's a difference between saying, I'm glad you made it, or you finally made it,
right,
to I'm happy you got here.
Yeah. Agreed. I mentioned to you earlier that, we have a lot of people from a lot of places that join us, and we've already talked about Canada and the UK, and I'm really happy to see my friend Linda on here, who is from New Zealand, where it is bright and early, I guess Friday morning, so you can let your students know, not only where they get a shout out, but people across the world got to know that they got a shout
Yeah, I
out.
can
So,
hear that.
Linda, glad that you're here. Let's look at a couple of the comments here. Let's see. Trisha, our colleges need to require trauma-informed practices as part of teacher education programs. I agree, and I think they need some neuroscience and trauma-informed education. Should not be an elective, but an absolute requirement along with mental health. Tracy said, my 12-year-old developmentally disabled traumatized kid got a $74 ticket from a school SRO for picking up a cigarette butt he found near the school bus and brought it into the school. We're fighting it. Why?
And this is an increasing problem that's going on with a lot of school districts, and these fines that are handed out by school resource officers. Now it's a debt. And how do you leave high school with a debt? It's awful that is happening across the country. And I hope that person is fighting it. And I wish the best outcome. That really upsets me to see that is happening to students.
Yeah, and I know that parent, and Tracy is one that will certainly be fighting it. But this is exhausting. As you mentioned, the kids get blamed, the parents get blamed. Everyone gets run down through all of this. It can be a challenge to be putting food on the table, taking care of all of your children. Now you've got something else that's on top of you when things are difficult enough already. This is tough. We talked a little bit about school resource officers, and I know even people that I've talked to that have very different opinions on SROs. But one of the things that I can never get out of my mind when it comes to the police and schools is, regardless, because I've heard this from all sorts of people. Oh, our kids love our school resource officer, or they're really great. And I think that we often forget that not everybody's experience is the same. There are people that have very negative experiences with police. There are communities that have very negative experiences with police, and a police officer around is not something that is subjectively helping everyone to feel safer. So can you talk a little bit more about your thoughts on police in schools and what we can be doing? And how does that, I think it seems pretty direct to me, but how does police in schools connect with the school to prison pipeline?
This is one of those fear-driven agendas where school shootings and having police officers, school resource officers in the building is promoting safety, when actually data says no, it doesn't. It promotes more violence, kids not feeling secure. It promotes a negative attitude towards schools. And I hear that a lot. We love our school resource officers. And a lot of those schools I hear that from function just fine without them.
Right.
They're just there. They're kind of the old community police. We walk in, we do a little, show. But for the most part, the presence of school resource officers that aren't trained in childhood brain development. I was in a school a while ago, and I was walking through the hallway with the principal, and the national anthem came on, or the Pledge of Allegiance, came on. And I stopped and, put my hand over my heart. And there's a kid that came in late trying to get to class. And the school resource officer said, "Why didn't you stop?" And now they're engaged in a conflict over he didn't stop that's not your job, even if you're in a school resource officer. And that's what happens. Teachers are using school resource officers as classroom management. If they're there for security, you're afraid of a school shooter, you're living in that fear, then keep them out the bathrooms, keep them out of hallway patrol, keep them out your classrooms. If that's the reason they're there, they should almost be invisible. But what's happening is they're not invisible. They bring their own biases, they bring their own education or lack thereof towards how schools should be functioning, and they bring law enforcement into the building. So now somebody not stopping and standing for the pledge has turned into a crime because it's now escalated to a verbal confrontation. And now an ego is involved, and it just turns out bad. And that's why you see kids getting handcuffed, and not over a crime, because most times it's not a crime. It's not a crime to disrupt class. It's not a crime to walk out. But they're turning into crimes because when children are experiencing trauma, you've turned a not doing my assignment or not standing for the pledge into an assault. And that's what's continually happening.
Yeah. And we've also found that, very often there's these kind of MOUs, kind of memorandums of understanding between a police department and a school. And, often in the things that we've seen, those MOUs may be very specific about the role of the police in a school. And often they are. Once they're there, they're brought in for school discipline. It's almost scared straight. Like, let's bring in the police officer to handle this, and get pulled into situations. And of course, I think there probably are people in those positions, officers in those positions, that know where the lines are and probably respect them and stay with them. But if you're being asked by somebody that you think you're there to serve to do something, you could very easily be pulled into situations that we should never have law enforcement involved in at a school.
And there's very tricky areas to that, because a principal could have questioning a student about an incident. If law enforcement's in the room, that conversation is not privileged.
Right.
And a lot of, I tell kids, either tell the law enforcement officer that they can leave, say I'm not talking until a parent arrives, or I'm not talking until an attorney arrives, if the police officer is going to be in the room, because that's kind of the way they skirt these MOUs. The principal or whoever is questioning a student about an incident, and the police officer's in the room. Now that's evidence. In the state of Maryland, that you don't have to Mirandize juveniles. So that's a problem.
You mentioned the lack of training, and what's interesting to me, I was actually last fall in a community event with our superintendent, and it was kind of a Q&A kind of event. A new superintendent was hosting, and police and schools came up, and I had asked the question, and somebody that was kind of involved with a program proudly responded to me to tell me that that the police that are chosen as SROs have 20 hours of training. And well, that was my response, right? I'm like, 20 hours. I mean, I've watched TV series on Netflix that are less than 20 hours. I mean, this is not adequate for switching from all the training you did in law enforcement to working differently with a 5-year-old, understanding brain development, understanding trauma, understanding all the things that you might need to do differently. And I don't think that's unusual. I think often there's little or no specialized training, and it's really inappropriate, don't you think?
Yeah. Listen, we have so much, you see a lot of police brutality, police corruption. And I know from being in law enforcement for 27 years, I went through that 8-hour ethics class too. But after that, you don't get much.
Right. And Linda just brought up, so grateful not to have SROs or similar here in New Zealand. So what's different about our kids here in the United States that we need SROs? And of course, I have an answer to that, which is nothing. Nothing is intrinsically different about kids in different places. And, again, we find that there are those that are successful without doing the things that we think we need to do, right?
Yeah. It's really, And who's paying for them? That
Mhm.
that that usually is where I start. Who's paying for these?
Mhm. Mhm.
Who
Mhm.
authorized taxpayer money to pay for these? Is the
Right.
school district paying? We have students that have lunch debt, but we're paying SROs to be in the building.
Mhm. Mhm.
You know, that money that goes to SRO can go to some lunch debt, can
Mhm.
go to a
Mhm.
social worker
Right.
that has an impact
Mm.
beyond security.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. A lot of progress to be made there for sure. So, what kind of work are you doing today? So, I know you speak around the country, around the state. Tell me about kind of the work you're doing today, and what you're doing to continue to contribute to bringing change about all of this.
Mm. One of the things I do is help children find their way through life after high school, whether that's financial aid wise, doing seminars on financial aid, and getting them money for college or preparing them for something else outside of high school, whatever career path they're choosing. So I talk to a lot of kids about goals and career choices. And just my first book was called Youth Champs, and the focus was on choices, habits, attitudes, mindset, and purpose. And I use that framework to build champions, as I say. Um, and with teachers, I try and do professional development with teachers and administrators that build on the relationships.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I like to start with educators is, what's your why? And like you said, why is a great question. If we're going to alter the trajectory of a child's life, then we have to know our purpose. So that's one of the things I start with. And then it's getting them back to, what are you grateful for? Where, how are you being stretched? And where do you need development at? So before I even go into a school, those are the questions I like to kind of survey with educators. And with administrators, I like to focus my talks on the culture of your building. And one of
Mhm.
the things I like to do is try and see the building through the eyes of your student. And I went through this with one principal, and I said, just walk through the building and tell me what you see. And, the principal, he said, I see a lot of sports trophies. And then I said, okay, when you get in, you turn left or right. He said, I'll turn right as a student, and I'll go down the hallway and I'll see the awards, the high SAT scores. There's more sports trophies and things. And as I go down the hallway, there's the gym to the right, and there's more sports trophies and mainly football. And I go to the left, and there's more about schools that are doing educationally well. And I said, do you feel represented? Do you feel affirmed? And he said, I do. But now that you mention it, if I'm that kind of borderline student that isn't involved in athletics or extracurriculars, I don't.
There's a lot of students that aren't involved in sports or
Right.
extracurricular. I mean,
Right. And if that's what you see when you walk in the
right,
building,
right.
imagine what that child feels like. I'm not an A student. I don't have a 1360 on my SATs. I haven't rushed for 1,000 yards, but that's all they see as they walk to the classrooms.
Mm, mhm, mhm.
And I think that kind of, if more people would do that, that would open their
I'm
eyes.
sorry.
You're fine.
Well, I was going to vacuum, but I don't
You
think
can say hi if you want to.
I'll just leave the vacuum to you.
Yeah, thank you. But if more people would do that, you might find that empathy
Mm,
for
mhm,
some of the students that you see. You might find out, you know, why they're doing some of the things that they do.
mm,
One of the stories I like to tell, my wife's a school counselor, is there was a student at her school who had beautiful hair. And one day he came to school and it was all cut off. So on the bus, they were teasing him about having a bald head. I don't know
mm.
why they tease him about being a bald head. I think
Yeah, I don't
bald is
know. I
beautiful.
don't know what's wrong with that.
Yeah, but they were teasing him on the bus.
Yeah.
So he put his hood on and he went to class with his hood on. Immediately, a compliance, punitive, take your hood off. Why do you have your hood on? Nobody thought to ask why. When somebody finally did, they found out that his older brother did something wrong, and the mom shaved the older brother's head. So in an act of solidarity, he shaved his own head.
Mm-hmm.
And if somebody would have just sat down with the child and said, why? And for me, a hood doesn't affect how you learn. You know, I wear Jordans. I still can't jump on a curb. You know, they haven't helped me. So we're taking these minor things and creating a mess with them. When we could just say why, what happened, and understand what some of these kids are going through.
Yeah. How can I help?
Rather than being disciplined.
Right.
And now he's disciplined at school. He's got in trouble at school. Now he has to go home and tell a parent who may be an adult child of trauma that he's been disciplined at school. So he's going to get additionally disciplined at home. She can't cut his hair. So what is she going to do next? And these are the things that they don't think about.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, you mentioned something that's always near and dear to my heart, and that's relationships. And I think relationships are always so critical in working with anyone. And I mean, and it's applicable to all of us. You know, we all feel the safest when we're with people that we know and that we trust and that see us and value us. We do our best work for people that we like, you know, whether in a career or in the classroom. You know, occasionally, and of course, you know, I think probably much like you know, we are very supportive of teachers and paraprofessionals and administrators and trying to be part of helping to find solutions versus just saying, hey, these things are all wrong. But, you know, as we talk about relationships, we sometimes hear things like, well, I just don't have time to make relationships with all the kids in my class. We sometimes find that, if I had to be honest with you, that sometimes people lack the, maybe even adults lack the skills to make those relationships or aren't sure how to do it. So tell me, I mean, as somebody that I think has built their career around this, around developing relationships, about seeing the strength of people through those relationships, you know, what is your advice for an educator that feels overwhelmed and is having a hard time? What might you say to somebody that is a first-year teacher that heard relationships are important but has no idea what to do? Any tips that you might offer?
Take the risk. And what I mean by risk is R is real relationships. And real relationships are developed through asking questions. What music do you like? What do you do after school? Do you like reading books? The other day, you know, I had students in my office and they said, Mr. Webb, get in this TikTok with me. And I got in TikTok.
If I had only known, I would have that ready to queue up.
Yeah, we could play it. But that shows I'm interested in you more than a student. I'm interested in you as a person. That's what a real relationship is. I'm interested more than just this educator student. I'm providing you something. I'm interested in you as a person and what you like, what you don't like. And sometimes that's hard because we have to be a little transparent. We have to be a little vulnerable, but that's the birth. That's how we have real relationships, is being vulnerable and being transparent. The I is for intentional actions, and being intentional with your time, being intentional with your resources, but also being intentional with how you do things. And what I mean by that is when you hear another teacher talking about a student in a negative way, you have to be intentional about interrupting. You just have to, because then we become the gossipers. And I always say the teacher's lounge is the worst place to be for the gossiping. So it's very important to be intentional with how you do things and to make sure, just like when I was in the prison system, giving handshakes and fist bumps, I was intentional about that. And I didn't let up regardless of, how I was treated. It was something intentional that I would do. And eventually people found out I wasn't going to give up on that. And when people find out that you're not going to let them talk negatively about a child, then that changes the culture. The S is for safe spaces. And like the board behind me, you can tell by what they wrote. They feel safe here. And when a child comes to me and says, let's take a selfie, I know they feel safe. I know it's more than a picture to them. It says, I feel safe. I feel affirmed. I feel represented. I have a selfie wall over here. I might show it to you.
That's great. That's great. Yeah. And authentic, right? I mean, it's about being authentic. I mean, I sometimes hear things like, well, it's a therapeutic rapport. No, it's about an authentic relationship. And I think even to the point of, my son's a good example. He's somebody I would call a relationship kid. I think a lot of kids are relationship kids, although some are even more dependent on it than others. And, if somebody's not willing to share a little bit about themselves, like that's not a relationship. That's like, you want me to tell you things, but you don't want to share anything with me. That's not real. It's not authentic. I mean, I think it's got to be authentic. Kids see right through things that aren't.
And when kids feel safe, they will tell you things and they will ask questions.
Yeah.
And the K for risk is for keep asking questions. How are they doing? What's going on? Just if there's something you don't understand it from a cultural standpoint, ask this question. We're not the authority on the kids are the authority on themselves. So it makes them feel empowered when you ask them questions. So that's what I like to call the risk, taking the risk. Through relationships, intentional actions, safe spaces, and keep asking questions.
Love it. Love it. Great practical advice. Well, listen, we have been going for quite some time now, and it's time for us to head towards wrapping things up. I promised you that I would have us done by a certain time, and I want to make sure I honor that. But as we're wrapping up, I just want to say, one, if you're watching and have any final questions, or just want to say thank you, feel free to in the chat. And for you, Leonard, just wanted to see if you had kind of any final thoughts, any final words, anything you wanted to share with us, as we wrap things up here today.
If this country wants to be the leader in education, it can't continue to be behind in the race to end the school to prison pipeline. We have to be trauma informed. We have to correct the disparities.
Absolutely. There's so much room and potential to do better. You earlier shared the quote that really resonates with me about, rather than trying to figure out, pulling people out of the river, let's go upstream and figure out why they're falling in. The other quote is the one about, when we can do better, that we should. And I didn't get that exactly right, but, kind of this idea that, do the best you can until you know better. And when you know better, do better. We know better now. And, it's about doing better. So I want to thank you for being with us. And I see a couple of thank yous beginning to pop here into our chat. This has been a great conversation. Really appreciate you setting some time aside to talk to us. Appreciate the students that left us some messages there, and the work you're doing. I mean, you've had a career of doing this really important work, and I think the scope of what you're doing now has so much potential. As you talk about, your children and grandchildren and what we can do to make the world a better place. This is really important, and I appreciate all that you're doing. Not just on behalf of your children and grandchildren, but mine and so many others. Thank you, Leonard.
Thank you for doing the work that you do. Very important.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I hope to get up to your area of the woods there, maybe over the summer, and maybe get an opportunity to visit with you. So at this point, we will end our broadcast. I want to thank everybody that was watching today for joining us. As always, I want to remind you, part of the point of doing these is this is really valuable information. The information that you learn in these live events that we do and the perspectives are critical for bringing about change. And the way we do that is we spread the word. So please share these live events with your fellow parents or educators, or if you're a parent, share them with your teachers. If you're a teacher, share them with your administrators. We need to do more to amplify all these important messages that we hear. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Leonard, you can hang around for a second and we will end the broadcast here, but I look forward to chatting with you again. Take care.